Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, mental health during COVID-19, transportation funding, but first, big stories of the week. As they say, let's get to it.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, we have some important topics to talk about, and joining me first is John Micek. He's the editor-in-chief of Pennsylvania Capital Star. He's one of the state's leading reporters. John Micek, welcome to the program.
Hey, how you doing?
I don't know yet. I'll find out after the show, but no, I'm delighted to have you. I'll tell you, there is a furor over the post office and whether or not they're going to be able to handle what will be an absolute flood of mail-in voting. 1.8 million Pennsylvanians in the June 2nd primary applied for mail-in ballots. 1.5 million actually voted, and that could double. So there's real concern that if things aren't adjusted properly, that the mail could be days and days and days late and might not even be counted. So,
yeah, I mean, Terry, this has been a warp speed story this week. It seems like every day brought a new headline. We know that President Donald Trump has been railing without evidence about fraud in mail-in balloting, which is non-existent as well, we know. Pennsylvania last year, with support of Republicans, by the way, passed a universal mail-in balloting, no excuse mail-in balloting law. And as you correctly point out, people took advantage of that during the June 2nd primary. We have seen internal changes at the U.S. Postal Service. Louis DeJoy, the Trump-appointed postmaster, has been cutting back on overtime. There are photographs of post boxes being removed, mail sorting machines being removed. The Postal Service sent a letter to 46 states warning that mail-in ballots might not be delivered or processed on time. And then just this week, State Attorney General Josh Shapiro announced that he was joining with 20 other states' attorneys general to sue over all of these changes. And then as that was happening, DeJoy abruptly backed off and said stuff wouldn't be changed until after the November 3rd election. Yeah,
well, Pennsylvania is one of 34, 35, it changes about every minute, 34, 35 states that you have to apply for the ballot. And you can apply up to a week before the election, November 3rd. And there's some sense that maybe you ought to say 2 weeks so people could get the ballots in and we don't have this problem. What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I mean, Nevada is getting hammered by President Trump this week because they have universal. They just send them out
everybody.
To
New Jersey did it too.
New Jersey does it as well, and Governor Phil Murphy is now being sued by the Trump campaign over their universal balloting law as well. It's a legitimate concern, Terry, that people are going to get. They need to get their ballots on time. They need to have them processed on time. The one upside to this is that you don't necessarily have to depend on the Postal Service. You can drive to your county board of election and drop it off in person up until Election Day.
And there's a debate over the drop boxes. Yeah,
which were used on primary day and are perfectly secure despite the rhetoric we've heard about them.
Yeah. Okay. We only have about 2 minutes left. Believe we well, this is an important subject. All right. As we tape this, we're in the midst of the Democratic Convention. I mean, it is so unusual. You've been to them, and I've been to them. No cheering, no confetti, no
balloon drop.
Yeah. And so what's your sense of, it seems to me, and the Republicans will probably do it, it seems to me, given the circumstances, that the Democrats are doing it pretty well, and I think the Republicans, they're learning a lot about how to do it virtually.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting week. After what you and I covering how many conventions between the two of us over almost 30 years, when the first night I tuned in, it felt a little odd. It felt a little off. I felt like a telethon or something. But I mean, the Democrats have really, I think, stepped up and kind of given sort of an archetype for how you can deliver this product virtually. There's been a lot more concentration on message. They've been really focused on showing the diversity of the country.
Right.
The state-by-state roll call on Tuesday night was fantastic.
With all the background. What I liked was the background.
They showcased the special parts of each state, and I want calamari after watching the Rhode Island delegation. But you also had, Terry, in particular speeches by former First Lady Michelle Obama, and then on Wednesday night by former President Obama, really pointed and very specific indictments of the current White House.
And by the way, it's unusual for a sitting president, past presidents, to weigh in the way President Obama did, and Bill Clinton was much tamer than he normally is.
The thing of it is, Terry, that norm got shattered about 3.5 years ago. President Trump's been on the attack against President Obama from day one, painting a really stark contrast, saying in as many words that the current president poses a threat to democracy. Mrs. Obama saying that if you don't think things can get worse, they absolutely will. Some really pointed messages. Last night we saw Wednesday night we saw former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords deliver really emotional remarks. And there is undoubtedly win, lose, or draw. A historic dimension to this. Kamala Harris, the senator from California, the first woman of color to be appointed to a major party ticket. So that in itself, no matter what happens, is a gigantic moment.
Look, believe it or not, this was a fast segment. We're out of time. Thanks for joining us. All right, coming up, mental health during COVID-19. Boy, what an important subject, and we'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
I'll tell you, mental health during COVID-19, what an important subject. It affects virtually everybody with sequestering and the shutdowns and the anxiety levels that go up. Well, joining me to talk about that and more is Dan Jurman. He's the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Advocacy and Reform. Dan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, before we get into some specifics, let's talk about the effects of COVID-19 on mental health generally, and then I know there's some specifics that we really want to get into. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this has really created a perfect storm in terms of mental and behavioral health for all Pennsylvanians. People have different resources and different levels of resilience in their lives to be able to get through a storm like this, but that doesn't mean that they're not feeling its effects. So everything from chronic stress and toxic stress to the traumas of having a loved one who you can't visit while they're in the hospital or has passed away from the disease, to children not being able to socialize in the usual ways that they do and not being able to see their friends and play.
Yeah, but they try.
They try. They try all the time.
we know they try. Go ahead.
Yeah, and tough decisions for parents to make in either direction. And so we see this showing up, people who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19, worried about how they're going to make ends meet, how they're going to keep their children safe, keep their elderly parents safe, keep themselves safe. Yeah. And those things take a toll. I mean, the way the human brain works is it's designed to protect us. And so when we don't have what we need, or there's something that's a threat, it forces us to focus on that, and it literally shuts down the parts of our brains that are in charge of self-regulation, emotional regulation.
I'll tell you, the anxiety level, I mean, I have it, and I'm sure that many of our viewers have it as well. The anxiety level just gets raised to a fever pitch during this situation.
Yeah, well, and it's day after day. I mean, there are tickers showing us how many people have the virus, how many people have died. We end up with a perception that if we walk outside of our houses, that it's everywhere. And then on the far end, there are other people who have shut down and even thinking that it's real. And so, it takes a toll, and no one is their best selves when they have this much stress.
Yeah. I'll tell you, there was a 2019 study that said about half of Pennsylvania children have had one adverse experience as a child. And given COVID-19, that may be increasing as you and I speak.
Oh, we have huge concerns about the number of children that we don't have touch with, who aren't in front of teachers and other people who can keep an eye on their physical and behavioral health every day. And we're terrified of both that and issues of domestic violence. These stresses lead to other abuses and other negative outcomes happening. And so, again, we've got this perfect storm where we expect negative outcomes to be worse, and that's why it's important that we help people reach the resources that they need during this time. We've created a new resource online in the governor's office.
We're going to put your website up, not to interrupt you. They'll put your website up at some point.
Perfect.
There it is. It's up.
Yeah, we realize government can be siloed, and we had information all over the place on different websites, and so this new page puts everything together of every mental health resource that we have for families.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the governor back in January, trauma-informed state, and what's going on to try to alleviate that. All right, we'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, welcome back. I'm talking with Dan Jurman. He's the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Advocacy and Reform. All right, Dan, let's talk a little bit about what's a trauma-informed state and why should people care about that?
Well, so we spend a lot of money on crisis in Pennsylvania and frankly across the entire nation. We tend to pay for helping people when things have gone way too far. And what we found out in brain science is that actually we can help people heal from trauma, and if we don't, that trauma affects the rest of their lives, and behavioral health, physical health, heart disease, strokes, cancer, you name it. Trauma drives a lot of our outcomes, and so the more
it affects the family members of folks who have the trauma, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it can lead to ongoing trauma. I mean, we've known about these cycles for years, that children who are abused are more likely to grow up, especially boys, are more likely to grow up to be abusers themselves, something like over 70%.
Right.
So in looking at becoming a trauma-informed state, we begin to recognize that if we spend money on healing and prevention, for instance, child abuse, 38% of all Pennsylvanians have experienced physical or emotional child abuse. That leaves scars. If you think about the average classroom size, that's 8 to 10 kids in every classroom who's trying to learn while going home and experiencing abuse. So if we want to have better outcomes, what science is telling us is that we need to start helping people heal and helping them understand that instead of asking them what's wrong with you, asking them what happened to you and figuring out how to get them better.
And you've also you also have some guidelines that you're developing to implement this trauma relief that the state has been working on.
Yeah, and this is really across all government agencies and all county offices, and even private nonprofits and faith-based organizations can do this. We've created a continuum to help people move from just being aware of what trauma is and what it does, all the way to focusing on how their organization can help people heal. Because as we've seen in the nonprofit world, where I spent most of my career, you put Band-Aids on people and then you see them back again a month later with the same issues. And so how do we get to curing people, healing people, and helping them have rich, full lives?
Yeah, it must be difficult, getting people's attention on this issue. I mean, it's something that a lot of people go through, the trauma and, as I mentioned before, the anxiety, but getting people to focus on it and to seek help for it, it has to be a really difficult challenge.
It is, until you start to sit down and explain it in plain language for folks, because it doesn't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It doesn't care whether you're wealthy or living in poverty. If you've experienced some of these things and they've changed the way that you're behaving, you need the same help. And so part of it is getting rid of the stigma, and part of it is just being able to explain this very complex issue in plain language.
Well, the other aspect of it is it's just not COVID-19, but you have the damage from trauma, whether it could be historical, it could be somebody who's gone through it from their youth, adolescence, etc. You've got what's called communal trauma, as well as racism. All of that, I mean, it's complex in terms of what develops as a result of the trauma, correct?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I explain it to people is my great-grandmother, who survived the Great Depression, into her 90s, still had the same behaviors that were attached to what happened to her when she was in her early 20s during the Great Depression. The trauma of that changed her behavior for a lifetime. So helping people to understand that and how these things impact them, racism, discrimination of any kind, these things affect our behavior, and they have people living in fear. I'm also helpful that COVID helps us have a moment of empathy, because right now we're all experiencing that kind of stress every day. And for folks who were experiencing these things before COVID-19, it helps us connect, understand how hard it is to just survive when every day is filled with fear and anxiety.
As horrible as COVID-19 is, and we all know it is horrible, has that helped, however, to call attention to the trauma that you all are trying to deal with?
Yeah, well, when you look at, for instance, I had someone reach out to me right after COVID-19 when we found out that African Americans were dying at a much higher rate. And they said to me, this is urgent. You know, what are we going to do about this? And my response was, this was urgent 10, 20 years ago. This has been urgent for generations. Because you can't, in the midst of the crisis, undo years and years of living in food deserts and not having access to health care. So this has shown a bright light on all the flaws that are in our system. And being in an office with the last name of reform, it's part of my job to figure out how we make the changes we need to make to fundamentally serve all Pennsylvanians in a different way.
All right, before I let you know, what's the next step?
So the next step is really what I'm doing right now, going out and talking to people, talking to audiences virtually these days, but helping people understand in plain language what this is, how it affects them and their children and their parents, and how they can get the help that they need, and how we can change the way we do the work.
All right, I want to thank you for coming in. Thanks for the update. All right, coming up, transportation funding. We're now on the roads much more. You get into the highways, we're on the Turnpike, and the Turnpike has some funding issues. What are we going to do about transportation in this state? We'll take that up in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, well, we're back on the roads in large numbers. We're on the Turnpike, which has been losing money, and the big issue comes up. What are we going to do about the condition of Pennsylvania roads? We couldn't have a better gentleman to talk about that, Bob Latham. He's the executive director of the Associated Pennsylvania Constructors. As always, Bob, welcome back.
Terry, thanks. Good to be with you again.
All right, I'll tell you something. It seems like every time you get some transportation funding, the money gets siphoned off one way or another and gets moved to some other activity function of Pennsylvania state government. So let's talk a little bit about what are the conditions of the roads. Let's start with that, and then I want to get into the funding and where this is all going to go.
Sure. Very quickly, again, a reminder, big transportation funding bill in 2013. We had hoped to be augmented by federal funding that didn't occur. And so that's eat into our ability to repair and upgrade roads. On the positive side, we've cut our bad bridge inventory from 6,000 to 3,000 over that 7 years. So that's quite an accomplishment. We have safer roads. We have the lowest number of highway fatalities in the history of the statistics in 2018. So I think that's something that we can all point to as a positive result. But like you said, there's still a whole lot to be done. We're falling behind on the maintenance of our interstates. The Federal Highway Administration has caused PennDOT to shift some of the funding from local roads, regional projects over to the interstates, and so we're hurting. And as you mentioned, we're diverting a lot of money out of the highway fund for other purposes, and that's one I'd like to see changed.
All right, what's the motor license fund, and why is that important?
Okay, well, the motor license fund is sort of the transportation fund. So all of us that go fill up our tank and pay the oil franchise or gas tax, all of us who pay registration fees and other fees, all that goes into what they call the motor license fund in order to pay for roads, both upgrades, rehabilitation, fixing bridges, and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, right after Act 89 was passed in 2013, the General Assembly increased the amount of money that is being taken out of there for the general fund for the operations of the state police to the tune of about $170 million a year more. Actually, the total got up to $800 million, which is like 12 cents of the gas tax, or 25% of the gas tax. So what we're calling for is a change of that and to put that money back into roads where it belongs.
I'll tell you, it's almost impossible to believe that you can divert this kind of money and still have roads that are in decent conditions. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe how that could happen and not have the roads just deteriorate. Or am I
well, we have a huge inventory of highways, more than 40,000 miles maintained by PennDOT alone, 70,000 miles additionally maintained by local governments in Pennsylvania. So it's a huge task. You're right.
Well, let's talk about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Ridership was down on the Turnpike. I haven't seen any numbers lately. I don't know if it's increasing. I would think it's been increasing, but what's going on with the Turnpike funding and how does that affect roads in the state?
During the pandemic, of course, the Turnpike saw a huge drop off of traffic, and of course that impacts their toll revenue. Back 10, even longer than Act 89, the General Assembly set up a schematic where the Turnpike would collect tolls and then sell bonds and shift that money over to pay for public transit. That formula or schematic ends in fiscal year 2022. So there's going to have to be a solution there. It's going to be about $1 million increase to general fund spending, if you will. So that's something that's coming up. Because of the pandemic, the general fund, of course, is showing a shortfall. And we think the General Assembly and the administration are going to have to deal with this. And we're suggesting that they go ahead and deal with transportation at the same time, which is go ahead and find a permanent fix for the Turnpike situation, and then also take basically return all the money from the motor license that's coming from your gas taxes and other user fees and put it back into roads because it's badly needed.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you to make a prediction. How successful is this going to be? As you know, the legislature faces shortfall in I think the collections are actually up a bit, but they've got to do the budget in November after the election. And what's your prospects for getting some of the money that you need?
Well, I think there's also another short-term issue, and that is funding for vehicle fees for electronic vehicles, which are currently not paying any gas tax or anything. That's a short-term, small amount of money, which we think can occur right away. But we think the General Assembly will take a look at what we're talking about here. I mean, they're going to have to make a huge lift in order to. We're
about out of time. I want to thank you for coming on. Great update. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, stay well.
Thank you.